So we're going to do things a little differently than, for those of you who have come to SIEPR events previously, we have some slides, and we're going to walk through and sort of talk about them as we go through. And I'm going to, maybe we put together these slides, and Bill has gotten some reaction, and we're going to talk a bit about them, then hopefully have a bit more of a conversation, and then open it up for all of you. But before I get to any slides, Bill, is there anything you want to say?
Just as a caveat to that effusive introduction, if you go to thesaurus.com and type in the word expert and then hit antonym, what you get is journalist. So, in a room full of people who have PhDs or who are working on them, I'd like to clarify that I'm not an expert, I'm just a journalist.
Well, no, it is, well, thanks for that, but I think I disagree with that assessment. But anyway, as someone who has
We're off to a great start then.
Yeah, okay. So great, so here we go. So I just want to get everyone sort of thinking about what crime in the US looks like. And so what we have put up here are some crime data from 2015 and projected crime data from 2016, because data has been now released by the FBI for the first 6 months of the year. And it's worth noting that here, these represent crimes reported to the authorities. The number is the first column of numbers. The rate per 100,000 people is in the second column. The third column includes data on the percent reported. So, for example, if you look, only 1/3 of rapes are reported, only about half of burglaries are reported, and so forth. And you can see the comparable numbers for 2016 in the next two columns and the percent change. So looking at that, it does look like we are seeing an increase, certainly in violent crime. But just, I don't know what your thoughts are. These are obviously just, we'll look at a longer picture on the next slide. So in any case, but what do you take from these numbers?
Well, Donald Trump is right that the crime is going up, but I think most social scientists would be a little cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from 1 year over the next year. Nonetheless, you can't be complacent about it, especially if you make policy. I really like the fact that you put in the percent reported numbers for this slide, because one thing that we run across all the time as journalists in pursuing criminal justice issues is the inadequacy of the data that's available. Part of that is just the fact that federal data is compiled by agencies of the Justice Department who are dependent upon 50 states and thousands of police forces to report data, and sometimes they report apples and sometimes they report oranges. But it is, it's a cautionary note about drawing sweeping conclusions from any of the data that's available. And a more sort of telling example of the inadequacy of the data is a couple years ago, or the year before last, I guess, the Washington Post and the Guardian set out to count the number of people who are killed in encounters with police in the course of a year. And they did it mostly by searching public reports, journals and newspapers and TV reports, and trying to verify them. And they came up with a number of roughly 1,000 people die, civilians die in encounters with police over the course of a year. There's also an official FBI estimate of how many people die in those encounters, and it's about half of that number. So, you don't want to put a lot of faith in the data. Our data guy at the Marshall Project always says, interrogate the data.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. And the assumption is that the murder data is pretty accurate, but even sometimes it's unclear if something was a homicide or an accident or what have you. But it is this is interesting. Now, if you look over a longer perspective, when I was, we have many students here, many undergraduates here. When I was an undergraduate back in the early 1990s, crime was a little different than it is today. But it is. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So the top series here is the crime rate, the violent crime rate per 100,000 people in large cities in the U.S., whereas the lower series is for the nation as a whole. So basically, crime rate's higher in cities than in non-urban settings. But from this, the news looks pretty good over the last 25 years, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. If you had the data for a third category, namely specific neighborhoods in cities, that you'd have an even higher spike to go above these two. But this is, there are a number of things that strike me about this. One of them is you can understand the politics of criminal justice by looking at these numbers. I mean, starting in the mid to late 60s, you had the war on drugs. Crime was going up, and along the way, you can sort of plot moments, political moments, that are explained by the amount of attention the crime was getting, the fear that people had of crime. So you have, in 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine at 100 to 1 in terms of how much, what kind of sentence you got, depending on the weight of the drug. You had in 94, I think, is Bill Clinton's fairly aggressive anti-crime bill, which you remember he was going to put 100,000 police on the streets, and there are a number of other measures. And then things level off in the 90s, and the rate starts to go down, and that also reflects a political shift. We now have a generation that's grown up without scary headlines about crime, with actual safer streets, and they're proving to be more receptive to the idea that maybe locking people up as much as we do is not such a good thing. So in 2010, for example, you have the repeal of or the modification of the 100 to 1 crack versus powder disparity reduced to 18 to 1, which didn't have any particular scientific basis, but represented a political retreat from the tough on crime.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned this idea that things can look different depending on where you shine the light. So this trend, this sort of downward trend that has been going on for quite some time, if you look within different areas, you can find places where the trends diverge from one another. So here we picked out, not just randomly, a couple of places, Milwaukee on the one hand, and Boston, my hometown, in the other. And they were at a pretty similar place back in 2010. Thoughts on the causes or consequences of this, what's happened since?
Yeah, this is a slide from an interactive graphic that we did at the Marshall Project.
That's right.
With a bunch of cities. And the point is, obviously, crime is local, like politics. But the one thing, I had never looked at the comparison of Milwaukee to Boston until Mark chose serendipitously to pick those two numbers, and it made me wonder whether that says something about the way that Wisconsin went in the elections. I'm not saying that it was decisive, but on a list of factors that gave Wisconsin to the Trump campaign, the crime rate in Milwaukee might well have been one.
Right, and it was, I mean, my understanding is that turnout in Milwaukee was much lower than it had been previously, and you can get a bigger picture of the murder rate in 26 of America's 30 largest cities and what's been happening to it. So 4 cities that are not reported here are Phoenix, Indianapolis, El Paso, and Portland, Oregon, I believe. They didn't get their data in, apparently, in time. And we have citations to all of this, and we'll post these later. It's not like a lot of these we relied on great analysis by others. In this case, it's the Brennan Center for Justice. The last figure was, as Bill had noted, the Marshall Project. But you can see here there's quite a bit of heterogeneity across the country. We've heard a lot about Chicago. So Chicago, I think, is right here. A lot of increases there. So was there anything here that kind of surprised you about these numbers?
No, except to reinforce the sense that, if you live in Baltimore, your view of the state of crime and safety in America is probably considerably different than if you live in one of the cities at the low end of the curve. Right.
So we can see San Francisco is pretty far to the right on this figure, Boston a bit further. But there have been, if you look carefully at this, it is the case that there are many more increases than reductions from 2015 to 16 within cities. So Memphis has seen quite a large increase, Detroit a big increase, but actually in Baltimore there has been a reduction. When we think about crime isn't random. There are some crimes that are random, but if we look at who is most affected by crime, now this is data taken from a report that was done by the Hamilton Project. That sort of tried to figure out how the burdens of crime differ across the income distribution. And so what's your take on this, this data right here?
Sort of a statement of the obvious. I mean, the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to crime, probably because you live in neighborhoods where other people are also poor and they prey on others.
Right. So if we look at, let's say, a number like attempted violence, it looks like basically 3 times higher among individuals whose family incomes are below 15,000 than among individuals whose family incomes are above 75,000, sort of 9 versus 27. This is taken from a criminal victimization survey as opposed to from the reported data from the agencies, where the victimization surveys give you detailed individual level information about people, where you can also see things like gender, race, and age. And so here we see some important heterogeneity by gender, by race, and by age. What's your take on some of these numbers here?
As you've probably already figured, my tendency is to look at the number and see how does it translate into the politics.
Yeah.
As we'll see in a later slide, black men are disproportionately incarcerated, but this slide underscores that they're also disproportionately the victims of crime, which is why in a lot of the stages during that up and down graph on the crime rates, where the Congress and states were enacting tough on crime measures, those were not enacted over the objections of black residents of the inner city. The crack disparity law, for example, was passed with support from the Congressional Black Caucus. That's, we tend to think that since Michelle Alexander of race has a big factor in mass incarceration, but it's also a factor in the victimization.
Right, absolutely. And you can see here too that the age distribution, the age distribution is quite concentrated. So people in their early 20s are by far the most likely to be victims of crime. And the bar to the left kind of understates the risk for people 17 to 19, because you've only got 3 years worth versus 5 years. So to some extent, the risk for 17, 18, and 19-year-olds is pretty comparable to the risk for people in their early 20s. And of course, for the rate is much higher among men than among women, about a 4-to-1 ratio of the victims. So these are taken from, I believe, the Marshall Project. And these are 10 not entirely crazy theories to explain the great crime decline. And so I think this is literally quoted from the site. And so do you want to walk us through, obviously each one of these bullets could be a topic on their own, but
yeah,
do you want to walk us through some of the highlights or what?
I went back and we did this a couple of years ago, and Dana Goldstein, who did it, has since left to go to work for the New York Times. But she wrote a column we called Justice Lab, which was mostly about the social science of crime. This was one of my favorite of her pieces, because everything on this list has serious, non-crazy social science behind it, disputed social science in most cases. The one that's been most widely discredited is the first one, the abortion filter, which argued that liberalization of abortion laws meant there were fewer unwanted children who grew up knowing they were unwanted and therefore turned to a life of crime. The argument's a little more sophisticated than that, but it's been pretty well refuted. The happy pill thesis is that the wider use of antidepressants and ADHD drugs resulted in less crimes of anger and rage and the psychologically driven crimes. The lead hypothesis, which still has a large following, it was sort of a trendy explanation, has that by removing lead from auto fuel and paint, there were fewer damaged children who grew up to be criminal. Aging boomers just basically says that my generation got old and mostly crime is a young man's business. The tech thesis credits a number of things. One is better policing technology, which I think there's going to be some discussion of later in the day. The other is that technology has reduced crimes in ways you may not automatically think of. People don't carry as much cash because they can go to an ATM or do online transfers. It's harder to steal a car these days because they're more theft-proof. Crack, I think everybody agrees that the crack epidemic had some impact on raising the crime rate when it went up, and some impact on it was what was known as a single-generation drug. It's not that it's been completely extinguished from our lives, but it's not as prevalent as it was. Obama mania basically says the economy got better, so there was less need for people to steal. The prison boom, this is one where you get a wide gulf of disagreement between supporters of the new administration and reformers. I think everybody agrees that there was locking people up who were criminals had some effect on the crime rate. There's a consensus that's in the sort of 20%, 10%, 20% of the crime decline is owing to that, but there are people, including the current Attorney General, who think it had a much more profound effect. There were more police on the street, obviously, and then there were controversial policing techniques, broken windows, and so on, that there's still debated what effect those had on the crime rate going down. And then finally, immigration, which is kind of interesting and timely. There's research that shows that upwardly mobile immigrants moving into poor neighborhoods, which are the only neighborhoods that a new immigrant can really afford to live in, tended to reduce the level of crime in those neighborhoods. Given the current demonization of immigrants, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Right, absolutely. And now these are the theories that are sort of been out there and have had the luxury of 10, 20, 25 years to look at. There's been less research on the recent uptick. Is it a blip? Is this the beginning of a trend? And here are some of the theories that are out there. What are your thoughts on these?
I kind of think that one of the lessons of 2016 is that journalists should be careful about predicting. and whether or not the 1 year uptick in crime is going to continue and what the causes of it are, I don't think we have the data. I mean, some of these clearly make sense. But there's a lot of reporting and research to be done to say what is the main effect.
Right. So it is, so lots of PhD and undergraduate theses lie ahead to the extent that first, depending on how the crime trajectory goes, to explore these sorts of things. And we're going to talk about a number of these as we go through the day. And to some extent, what we're trying to do in this first session is tee up some of the issues for later today. And related to that, we're going to have a session on policing. And we thought that this was an interesting, some interesting data to look at when you think about the relationship between police and the community. That sort of, this is basically police and the public are asked the same question. Does the public understand the risk and challenges that the police face? And there was, I don't know, a little difference between the two.
What's the date on that?
What is the date on that? That is a survey that was conducted from May to August of 2016.
2016. So it's probably not the Ferguson effect.
Maybe not the Ferguson effect, right, right.
I mean, I do think, just anecdotally, that there's a bit of a kind of Rodney Dangerfield attitude among police, that they don't get no respect.
Right.
But I don't know whether that's more pronounced today than it was 20 years ago.
Right. But it's interesting, if you look, for example, at what fraction of the public thinks that they don't understand the risks and challenges that police face, they think it's 3% answer yes to that, whereas the police say 13 times as much at 40%. And on the other side, 38% of the public think they understand it very well, whereas only 1% of the police do. So it's a really stark contrast between the two groups, and I think this is really going to related to some of the stuff we're going to talk about in an upcoming session. Similarly, this is a data that we've all seen a bit, the correctional rate, and plotted here, we've got a number of 5 different categories that are plotted here from 1980 through 2014. This is the rate per 100,000 residents. And so you can see that at the bottom is the fraction who are on probation. And we've also put the raw numbers there to the right so that you know what are the raw number of people. So there are 3.8 million people right now in the US who are on probation, another 800,000 on parole, another 700,000 in local jails, 1.3 million in prisons, state prisons, and another 200,000 in federal prisons. But obviously that has changed a lot over the years, but it's been coming down over the last several. What to you is, I think to me, the probation and parole numbers, I didn't realize that they were as high as they are.
Right. I mean, people don't generally factor those into the, we hear the statement that there are 2.2 or 2.3 million incarcerated, broken down, I think 200,000 in federal prisons, 1.3 million in state prisons, and the rest in the sort of churning through the county jail system. But that big light green patch at the bottom is important and often overlooked, just in terms of how many Americans are actually being supervised by the authorities. One thing that this graphic doesn't tell you is that America is an outlier in terms of incarceration. The numbers that are most commonly used that are pretty close to accurate are that America has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated people.
Right.
We have longer sentences for the same crimes as other industrialized countries. We lock up a lot of people. This graphic also excludes one of the fastest growing areas of incarceration, which is immigrant detention.
Right. That's right. Yeah, that's not listed here, but it is. I mean, to echo your point, there are actually twice as many people on probation or in parole as there are incarcerated. So about 4.6 million versus 2.3 million. So it's a very large number, and that risk does not vary by race, ethnicity, and gender. So as you can see here, the risks are quite a bit higher for men than for women, and differ a fair amount, higher for black men than for white men, higher for Latino men than white men, and that we're certainly going to be talking about this further as we go through the day. Mm-hmm. Anything you'd want to mention here?
Mm-hmm. No, it's kind of a statement of the sad obvious.
Right. Right. And so one thing that you've shown the light on is some research indicating that the sort of conventional wisdom for why incarceration has exploded the way that it did over the years was not necessarily just locking up people for smoking marijuana or being caught with marijuana, but that prosecutors may play a role.
Yeah, this is a big debate at the moment, and I think one thing that impresses me about it is that it's nice to have some economists in the argument about criminal justice. John Pfaff, who wrote this book, is at Fordham University in the law school, but he's also a University of Chicago trained economist, and he sort of sets up the standard theory of why so many people are incarcerated in America, and then tries to debunk or at least diminish the arguments for each of them. What he ends up concluding, he's not really the anti-Michelle Alexander, whose book frames the criminal justice system largely in racial terms. He agrees that it's a racialized system, but he argues that the war on drugs was not the main reason for the growth in incarceration. That the factor that he thinks is most overlooked is prosecutorial discretion. And he has some data in the book that shows arrests for violent crime going down, but charges filed going up, which seems to support his thesis. I think there's an ongoing argument about whether he pushes the data too far.
Right.
But it's a healthy argument to have.
That's great. And So let's see, and then just a couple last things, because we are at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, shining the light on some of the economics here, and it's interesting if you look at, and how much of this is a causal effect versus something else is by no means clear, but if you look, the sort of earnings of people who have ever been incarcerated versus similarly aged people who have never been incarcerated are quite divergent, as this figure here makes clear. And I want to have some time for questions, so maybe unless there's, then I just want to throw up one final figure. I alluded at the beginning to the costs of the criminal justice system, and it is, I mean, you actually pointed me to this very interesting study, so maybe you can walk us through the numbers in here.
Well, it's, there's the standard number that's thrown around for the cost of incarceration in the country is it's around $80 billion. And that's looking at the actual cost of the agencies that arrest and detain and parole inmates. But what the researchers at Washington University in St. Louis tried to do was calculate the social costs. Every costs in lost income for people who've been incarcerated, costs to their families and their children and their communities, and they come up with a total of $1 trillion. Whether that's the right number or not, I have no way of knowing. But it's an interesting piece to read, and it's in one of the professional journals.
Right. Yeah. No. It's
findable online.
Yeah. Exactly. And we'll, like I said, we'll put these up later. So we have we have a very tight day in terms of I would like a lot more time for questions. We've got here about 10 minutes for questions, and I'd like to start and make sure that it is a student who asks the first question. Here we are at the Policy Forum where we're trying to engage students especially. So I want to see if there are any students here who want to start with the first question of the day. And I have to single out the students because they tend to be shy. Libby. So we need a not except Libby. Let me just tell you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm not familiar with the definition of the Ferguson effect and what you anticipate, how someone might anticipate that changing the crime rate, and then what the arguments for and against that effect are. Do you mind elaborating on that point?
Yeah, usually the Ferguson effect is, there are variations, but the most common definition of it is that police feel that they are no longer trusted in the community because of, they would say, hostility from movements like Black Lives Matter, and therefore they're reluctant to go into the communities where crime happens. And so the crime rate goes up because the police are being more careful.
Right. Okay, additional questions from the audience? Okay, this is back here.
I have a question about the graphic showing median income for those who had ever been incarcerated versus never. Does ever being incarcerated include juvenile incarceration? Is there studies that show the impact of that?
My recollection is that this does include whether people have been incarcerated as juveniles, but I'm looking at Justin, who may know better. Justin, do you know if you're not sure? Okay, but I'm pretty sure that this data includes that it's basically based on basically 18 to 49-year-old men incarcerated at least once during the period 79 to 2012. And so I think it is asking them, the 18-year-olds, for example, are basically asking about whether you've been incarcerated as a juvenile. So that's how they get, for the 18-year-olds, I think it would be, that would be really the only time that they could look at. Additional question over here.
Is there data that reflects states that have strict gun control laws versus states that have looser gun control laws, or in the case of my home state of Georgia, you must own a gun in certain cases?
So
I'm sure there is, but I don't.
I'm going to tap the expertise of Professor Donahue from Stanford Law School. So, Professor Donahue, would you like to weigh in on this? He's studied this topic a little bit. Right here in the red shirt. It's right here in the. So you can, yeah.
Well, I think the question was, is there data? And of course, the answer is yes, there's plenty of data on that question. But obviously, things are very confounded. Many of the states that have the most lax gun restrictions are rural states that, as the earlier graphic showed, have much lower crime rates. But it is a debate that's been going on for about 20 years now. When states, for example, allow citizens to carry concealed weapons, what impact does that have on crime? John Lott had originally argued that it reduced crime. I've got a paper coming out suggesting that it increases crime, but every position in between those two extremes has been articulated. Let me just say one thing about the Ferguson effect. It might play out in a few city arenas, but the idea that the Ferguson effect had a national impact, I think, is really quite unlikely. I think there are lots of things that have been going on with crime, but one thing that you didn't mention that I think is probably worth stating is that the National Crime Victimization Survey suggested in 2015 that it was the first time in history that the number of people in the United States who were victims of violent crime fell below 1% for the year of 2015. So we are getting some conflicting figures on what's happening with crime, and it'll be interesting to see what the 2016 both UCR and National Crime Victimization Survey data shows.
That's great. Okay, the 2016 survey data, though, is not yet available. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, great. Additional questions from the audience right here?
Thanks. So in the last 20 years or so, there's been a shift in policing from a policing which is a little more preventative towards one that is very proactive. I mean, we see that in policies like that are quota-oriented. We see it in stop and frisk. We see it in civil asset forfeiture. And that proactive policing is essentially about making sure that there is a certain amount of data which can come to justify some policing. And so I think there's an important shift here that would be interesting to look at too. How much does this larger trend in policing having to justify itself in a way as being one way to disaggregate these kinds of questions further? That this is something that is becoming a very big political kind of question too. So I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, well, it's not coincidental that at the same time police departments have become much more addicted to data. The whole sort of ComStat, where you are judged based on very clear metrics, and people tend to take that as an incentive. You enforce the laws that you get rewarded for. David Simon, who wrote The Wire, but was also a great police reporter in Baltimore, says that it has a riff on the war on drugs and the effect that it had on crime, on policing. And his thesis is that because the war on drugs was what you got scored on, how well you were doing, and it's fairly easy to go out and do minor busts on the streets of Baltimore, that Baltimore cops stopped doing murder policing. The close rate for murders in Baltimore went down as the arrest rate for drugs went up. Which is, I think, reinforcing your point that cops too can become slaves to data.
Right. Okay, additional questions? I know, Libby, you had another question, so it is, Sean, can you get to her, and then you, yeah, okay, great, yeah, okay, great.
Thank you. I think there's some, it was on the list, there's some thought that a rise in crime in the cities is correlated with crack cocaine use. Do you think there might be a similar increase in crime in rural areas given the increasing abuse of opioids that's been documented recently?
Yeah, I think there's some research that shows there was an increase in rural crime associated with the meth problem first. I mean, again, with my caveat about predicting, I think there's an assumption that the opioid epidemic will begin to show up in the statistics. I mean, it's as a generalization, the crack cocaine problem was treated as a law enforcement problem. The opioid epidemic is being treated as a mental health problem for reasons that are obvious and a little shameful. I mean, both of them were health problems. But yeah, I think it's probably safe to assume that we'll see some evidence of that in the 2016 numbers, maybe 2017 numbers.
Right, absolutely. We also have a question from Joan Petersilia, who we'll be hearing from. Sean, right here. Sorry to keep working you, Sean. Yeah.
I was just wondering if anybody's given serious thought, when you show the decline in crime, you see that the national average decline in crime is driven mostly by property crime. And so I've always wondered, you know, so we measure 7 crimes, the FBI index crime, robbery, rape, aggravated assault, murder, et cetera, the 7, and they have been the same 7 that we have measured since the beginning of time. I've thought and wondered, and my question is the property crime going down really because we don't measure things like if your cell phone was stolen? We replace a cell phone, we don't usually go to the police. Identity theft, we don't know exactly who to report that to. You report it to your credit card and they replace your credit card and you move on. So that many of the property crimes are actually still happening, but the 7 that we measure have declined in the ways that you said. So robbery, we think about, you know, that doesn't happen. Bank robbery almost never happens anymore. It's not that crime, so I've been thinking a lot about this, about is it what we measure so that we get the crime decline, and that things that we aren't measuring are in fact increasing and would not show the decline.
Yeah. I think that's why it's a good thing that Mark included in this slide the reported crime numbers too. I mean, just to highlight the fact that there's a lot of crime that doesn't get reported, and it probably including, I hadn't thought about it, but the cell phone and the identity theft crimes that people don't know. I mean, they know they're crimes, but they don't really think to call 911.